My name is Cassidy Miller, and at 31 years old, I've finally learned that being the responsible one in a family of narcissists is just a polite way of saying you're the unpaid infrastructure holding up their delusions. I work as a senior logistics analyst for a major defense contractor in Arlington, Virginia, a job that requires me to track millions of dollars in hardware across global supply chains with surgical precision. I am the woman who ensures that every bolt, fuel cell, and microchip arrives exactly where it needs to be. Yet in my own family, I am treated like a ghost who only materializes when someone needs a bill paid or a mess scrubbed. The breaking point didn't happen in a shouting match. It happened during a group photo at the prestigious Fort Myer Officers Club, under the suffocating glow of crystal chandeliers and the smell of overpriced prime rib. "Move out of the picture. Your plain face is ruining the aesthetic," my sister Sloane sneered, her voice carrying that sharp, practiced edge of someone who has never been told no. Sloane is the golden child, a 34-year-old socialite who spends her days curating an Instagram lifestyle funded entirely by my parents' retirement accounts and occasionally my own credit cards. She was standing there in a $3,400 white tailored Victoria Beckham dress, her hair blown out into perfect platinum waves that cost more than my monthly utility bill for my two-bedroom apartment in Alexandria. I looked down at my own outfit, a charcoal gray and tailor suit I'd bought on sale for $180 because I'd spent my last bonus covering the $4,200 property tax lien on our parents' house that they forgot to mention. I stepped out of the frame, my heels clicking hollowly on the polished oak floorboards. As the photographer adjusted the lighting to capture the perfect family unit, my father in his retired colonel's dress blues, my mother draped in a vintage Chanel scarf, and Sloane looking like a department store mannequin, I felt the cold sting of a lifetime of invisibility. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was the logistics coordinator for their vanity. I was the one who handled the $650 monthly grocery deliveries to their doorstep, the one who negotiated the 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S lease for my father because his credit score had cratered, and the one who sat in the waiting room for 6 hours during my mother's gallbladder surgery while Sloane was finding herself at a yoga retreat in Tulum. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that comment at the Officers Club was the final pebble that started the avalanche, you have to understand the economy of the Miller household. My parents live in a 4-bedroom colonial in North Arlington where the mortgage is $5,800 a month, a sum they haven't been able to afford since my father's consulting firm folded 3 years ago. I've been quietly funneling $2,500 every month into their joint checking account just to keep the lights on and the water running. They don't thank me. They treat the money like a tribute they are owed for the burden of raising a plain daughter who chose spreadsheets over pageants. As the flash of the camera went off, capturing a lie that would surely be posted to Sloane's 50,000 followers with a caption about family first, I stood by the buffet table staring at a plate of lukewarm spanakopita. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from my bank. A charge for $1,200 at a high-end boutique in Georgetown. Sloane had used the emergency credit card I gave her for car repairs to buy shoes for this very party. I looked at the golden trio in the photo, laughing and radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from having someone else catch your fall. I realized then that I wasn't just ruining the aesthetic of their photo. I was providing the entire gallery, the building and the lighting, only to be told I wasn't fit to be seen in it. The silence of my realization was louder than any argument we'd ever had. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't demand the card back. I simply walked toward the exit, the smell of her expensive perfume lingering in my nose like a toxic fumes, knowing that the next time the infrastructure failed, I wouldn't be there to fix it. This was the moment I stopped being a daughter and started being a spectator to their inevitable collapse. The contrast inside the Fort Myer Officers Club was sickening. A suffocating blend of vintage $200 bottle Krug champagne and a performative brand of false patriotism that felt as thin as the gold leaf on the overpriced dessert trays. I stood near the buffet, my fingers brushing the edge of a mahogany table, watching my father command the room with an unearned authority that set my teeth on edge. To the retired generals and defense contractors surrounding him, he was still the formidable Colonel Miller. But to me he was a man who had hemorrhaged exactly $214,000 in high-leverage cryptocurrency trades and speculative tech stocks over the last 18 months alone. He gestured grandly with a crystal tumbler of Macallan 18, acting as if he owned every square inch of the polished oak floorboards. while my mother stood by his side like a curated porcelain doll. She glanced at my $60 Target slacks with a clinical, biting disdain, her eyes tracking the slight pilling of the fabric as if I had arrived wrapped in a discarded parking ticket rather than the professional attire I wore to my 12-hour shift as a senior logistics analyst. They had no idea that the very floor they stood on was effectively held up by my exhaustion, as they remained blissfully unaware that I had spent the last 5 years quietly wiring a cumulative total of $620,000 through a series of discrete shell accounts to keep them from a humiliating public bankruptcy. I had covered the $5,800 monthly mortgage on their North Arlington Colonial, cleared the $14,000 property tax liens they were too proud to acknowledge, and even paid for the tailored dress uniform my father wore with such misplaced arrogance. To them, I was merely practical and administrative, the dull, invisible daughter who was good with spreadsheets but lacked the aesthetic grace of my sister Sloane. They viewed my financial stability as a mundane trait rather than a lifeline, never questioning how their bank accounts stayed buoyed while their investments turned to ash. Sloane stood in the center of the room, a vision in a $3,400 white tailored Victoria Beckham dress, her platinum hair styled into waves that cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget at Whole Foods. When she hissed at me to move out of the frame because my plain face was ruining the aesthetic of her Instagram-ready family portrait, the irony felt like a physical weight in my chest. I stepped back into the shadows of the velvet curtains, watching the photographer capture a lie of prosperity that I had personally funded. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a notification from my American Express account, showing a $1,200 charge at a boutique in Georgetown. Sloane was using the emergency card I provided for her car repairs to buy the very heels she was using to stomp on my dignity. I watched my father laugh, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings, and I realized that I had spent half a decade acting as the silent infrastructure for a family that didn't even see me as a person. I was the one who negotiated the lease on the 2024 Midnight Black Tesla Model S in the parking lot because his credit score had cratered below 600, and I was the one who ensured the utility bills were paid so the lights didn't go dark during their lavish dinner parties. As the camera flash flared again, illuminating their practiced smiles, the cold reality finally settled in my bones. I wasn't a daughter to them, I was an insurance policy with a pulse. The silence of my decision to finally stop the transfers was louder than any shouting match, a quiet conclusion to a lifetime of being the invisible safety net for people who only loved the version of me that signed the checks. Family isn't just about the blood in your veins, it is about the hands that reach back for you in the dark. And as I looked at the three of them basking in the glow of the chandeliers, I realized my hands were the only ones that were ever dirty from the work of keeping us all afloat. The betrayal reached its agonizing peak when I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of my late grandfather's study and saw the hollow velvet-lined void where his legacy used to breathe. The glass display case, a custom-built humidor-style cabinet that had once housed General Miller's 1954 Breitling Navitimer and his tarnished 1942 ceremonial brass compass from the North African campaign, sat stripped and skeletal under the dim recessed lighting. I stood frozen, the scent of old leather and cedar mocking the sudden emptiness of the room, while the realization settled in my gut like a lead weight. Sloane had sold them, the only pieces of our history that weren't for sale, just to scrape together a down payment on a $125,000 polar white Mercedes-AMG G63 that was currently idling in the driveway with a vanity plate that cost more than my monthly insurance premium. When I confronted her in the foyer, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated fury, she didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her designer dress and laughed, a dry, metallic sound that echoed off the marble tiles. "Sweetheart, move along and get me another drink. You already blend in with the catering staff anyway," she sneered, thrusting her empty Crystal Rocks glass toward my chest with a flick of her wrist that sent a stray drop of expensive gin onto my sleeve. I looked at the glass, then at her, seeing the utter lack of soul behind her perfectly applied mascara, while my Aunt Lorraine leaned against the banister and chuckled, taking a slow, performative sip of her chilled 2021 Cakebread Cellars Chardonnay. The injustice of it was a physical pressure in the room, especially as my parents stood only a few feet away, studiously examining a painting on the wall as if the sudden disappearance of their own father's most prized possessions was merely a minor clerical error they couldn't be bothered to address. They turned their heads in unison, a synchronized gesture of cowardice, refusing to meet my eyes because acknowledging my pain would mean acknowledging the monster they had spent 30 years feeding with praise and unearned luxury. I am 31 years old, a woman who understands the precise value of things because I am the one who calculates the cost of keeping this family's hollowed-out reputation from collapsing into the dirt. While Sloan was busy liquidating our heritage for a depreciating asset with a twin-turbo V8, I was the one who had spent the last week reviewing the $14,200 invoice for the very gala she was currently using as her personal runway. I looked at the empty space on my grandfather's desk where the compass used to sit, the instrument that had guided him through a world war, and realized that the only person in this house with a sense of direction was the one they treated like a ghost in the hallway. My father's silence was the loudest sound in the room, a betrayal that felt more permanent than the loss of the Breitling, as he adjusted his tie and walked toward the bar without a single word of defense for the daughter who had saved his home from foreclosure just 6 months ago. Standing there in the center of the foyer holding my sister's dirty laundry and her empty glass, I felt the final thread of my loyalty snap with a clean, surgical precision. They wanted me to be the invisible help, the quiet administrator of their decadence, but they forgot that the person who manages the logistics also holds the keys to the vault. Family isn't a collection of blood relatives who share a last name and a penchant for cruelty. It is the shared respect for the ground you stand on, and as I watched Sloan walk away toward her new white Mercedes, I realized that I was done being the foundation for a family that didn't deserve to stand. The weight of the glass in my hand felt like a countdown, a cold reminder that once you realize you're being treated like a stranger in your own home, you might as well start acting like one and walk out the door for good. The heavy condensation on the windshield of my 2018 silver Honda Civic felt like a shroud, blurring the neon glow of the Arlington skyline into a smear of cold, indifferent light as the clock on the dashboard flickered to 11:22 p.m. I sat in the suffocating silence of the dark parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, while my breath hitched in the stagnant air that smelled faintly of the $4 wall coffee I had used to survive my 14-hour shift. With a hand that finally stopped trembling, I reached into the glove box and pulled out my secondary phone. A rugged, encrypted satellite handset I used for high-security defense contracts. A device my family didn't even know existed because they never bothered to ask what a senior logistics analyst actually does. Through the driver's side window, I could see the grand, illuminated lobby of the officers' club where a digital welcome board blinked with the nauseating script, celebrating Sloan Miller. It was a monument to a woman whose only achievement was successfully spending my salary while convinced she was the protagonist of a story I was merely funding from the wings. My family loved the version of me that was quiet, predictable, and fundamentally useful, the one who absorbed their financial blunders and social cruelty like a high-end acoustic foam, but they were about to discover that they absolutely hated uncertainty. I looked at the glowing screen of the satellite phone, my thumb hovering over the command to sever the automated bridge payments that kept their world from spinning into chaos. For 5 years I had been the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that cleared the $2,400 monthly interest on my father's predatory crypto loans and settled the $1,100 utility bills for a house they could no longer afford to heat. I decided right then, with the cold precision of a tactical strike, that there would be no more absorbing the blame for their failures and no more subsidizing the very hands that slapped me. If they truly wanted me to be invisible, then I would become the ghost that haunts their bank accounts, the sudden vacuum where a fortune used to be. I watched through the glass as my father adjusted his cufflink, the one I had replaced when he lost the original in a drunken stupor last Christmas, and I realized that the man in that frame was a hollow shell held together by my wire transfers. I opened the secure banking app, my eyes scanning the ledger of the $620,000 I had bled out to maintain their aesthetic, and with 3 deliberate taps, I deactivated the standing orders to the North Arlington mortgage servicer and the lease payments for the Tesla. The suddenness of the liberation was dizzying, a sharp contrast to the years of slow, grinding resentment that had defined my existence in the Miller household. I wasn't just cutting them off, I was reclaiming the oxygen they had been stealing from my lungs for 3 decades. As I shifted the Civic into reverse, the backup camera grainy and dim compared to the high-definition displays in the cars I paid for, I looked at the officers' club one last time. They were still inside, laughing and drinking champagne that cost more than my monthly car insurance, completely unaware that the foundation of their lives had just evaporated in the dark of a rainy Tuesday night. The silence in my car was no longer heavy. It was a clean slate, a quiet declaration that the Bank of Cassidy Miller was officially closed for business. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but when it becomes a predatory loan, the only moral choice is to default and walk away into the night. I pulled out of the lot, the red taillights of my humble Honda fading into the mist, leaving them to face the morning light and the reality of a world where I was finally, truly gone. The air in the forensic auditor's office was thick with the suffocating scent of aged leather bindings and the acidic metallic tang of an industrial espresso machine that hummed like a low-grade migraine in the corner of the room. I sat across from Elias Thorne, a man whose eyes held the weary cynicism of someone who had spent 30 years watching families dismantle one another for sport, and watched as he ceremoniously flipped open a heavy manila folder that contained the blueprint of my own social execution. Inside were 48 months of meticulously tracked wire transfers, a paper trail of my own misplaced loyalty that totaled more than some small-town budgets, but the real weight in the room came from the small digital recorder sitting on the scarred oak desk between us. At exactly 2:14 a.m. on the recording I had captured from the bug I planted behind the Georgian molding in Sloane's bedroom, her voice came through the speakers with a clarity that made my skin crawl, sounding sharper and more predatory than I had ever heard it in person. She was speaking to a man named Major Sterling, a disgraced logistics officer who had been sniffing around my father's remaining assets like a vulture over a dying animal, and her tone held none of the sisterly affection she performed for the cameras at the officers' club. Cassidy won't push back because she has the personality of a floor mat and the emotional range of a calculator, Sloane drawled, the sound of a lighter clicking and a long exhale of cigarette smoke punctuating her words with a casual cruelty that made my stomach turn. We will transfer the $1.8 million North Arlington house into the private trust by the end of the fiscal quarter, kick the old man into a state-subsidized assisted living facility once the equity is drained, and by the time the paperwork clears she is legally out of the picture with zero recourse. I sat there in the dim light, my fingers tracing the cold condensation on a bottle of San Pellegrino, listening to my sister discuss my displacement as if she were debating the disposal of an old piece of furniture. The financial documents spread out before us told a story of systematic theft, showing how Sloane had been siphoning the emergency funds I provided into a secondary account held in Sterling's name, essentially using my own salary to build the cage they intended to trap me in. Elias leaned back, the springs of his chair groaning under the weight of the revelation, and looked at me with a grim nod that confirmed the legality of the betrayal. The house, a sprawling colonial with a 2024 tax assessment of $1,842,000, was the final piece of the Miller legacy, and they were planning to treat our father like a line item to be deleted while I was left holding the empty bag of their combined debts. I looked at the welcome board in the lobby of my mind, the one that celebrated a version of a family that never truly existed, and I felt the last lingering spark of guilt evaporate into the recycled air of the office. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and my logistics-oriented mind for a lack of imagination, never realizing that the same person who knows exactly how to move a tank across a continent also knows exactly how to move a fortune out of reach. As the recording looped back to the beginning, Sloane's laughter echoing through the small office, I realized that the time for being a safety net was over. I wasn't just a floor mat, I was the ground they were standing on, and I was about to open a sinkhole beneath their feet that no amount of designer dresses or false titles could ever fill. Family isn't just a shared history of holiday dinners and staged photos, it is a contract of mutual protection, and since they had decided to breach that contract with such clinical malice, I was more than ready to file for a total and permanent foreclosure on their reality. The atmosphere inside the ballroom for Sloane's honorary appointment party was a suffocating masterclass in unearned prestige, a meticulously curated trap that smelled of $200-an-ounce Joe Malone candles and the metallic sharp tang of a $9,000 catering spread from Caviar Russe. There were 55 guests circulating through the space, a sea of silk ties and Botox smiles, all bobbing to the rhythmic, expensive and entirely forgettable strains of a string quartet positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the North Arlington estate. I arrived exactly at 8 p.m., the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind me as I stepped onto the polished marble in a sharp charcoal gray bespoke suit from Garrison Bespoke that cost exactly $4,200, a figure that exceeded Sloane's entire monthly discretionary allowance by several $100s. I wasn't carrying a crystal flute of vintage Krug like the rest of the parasites in the room. Instead, my fingers were curled around the cool, brushed aluminum edge of a high-end tablet. The screen dimmed but the processor humming with the weight of the data I had spent the last 72 hours compiling. My father, resplendent in a tuxedo that I had personally picked up from the dry cleaners 3 days prior, caught my eye from across the room and offered a look that was less of a greeting and more of a tactical dismissal. "Stand in the back near the catering entrance so you don't clutter the shot for the society photographers," he murmured as he brushed past me, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and the arrogance of a man who still believed he was the architect of his own fortune. I simply nodded, the muscles in my jaw tight but my expression as neutral as a blank spreadsheet, and moved toward the shadows cast by the heavy velvet drapes. I watched as Sloane, draped in a $5,000 ivory silk gown that she had charged to my secondary account under the guise of essential business expenses, preened for the cameras and accepted the hollow congratulations of people who only liked her because they thought she was the gateway to our father's non-existent liquidity. The injustice of the scene was a physical weight, a vivid display of the golden child syndrome that had defined every holiday and milestone of my 31 years. But tonight the script was being rewritten in real time. My mother was busy showing off a sapphire pendant that I knew for a fact was a high-quality lab-grown imitation because I had blocked the wire transfer for the genuine Harry Winston piece 6 weeks ago, yet she wore it with the same misplaced pride she used when talking about Sloane's visionary career. I stood there, the invisible infrastructure of their lives, listening to the quartet play a Vivaldi piece that felt like a funeral march for their reputations, and waited for the clock to strike the hour. Every detail of the room, from the $1,200 floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and eucalyptus to the exact 68-degree temperature maintained by the industrial HVAC system I had repaired last July, felt like a debt that was finally coming due. When the house manager finally stepped toward the podium to test the microphone, the sharp electronic feedback cut through the room like a gunshot, signaling the beginning of the end of the Miller family's carefully managed aesthetic. I adjusted the tablet in my hand, my thumb hovering over the broadcast command that would link my forensic files directly to the 85-inch 4K Sony display mounted behind the podium, and prepared to show them exactly what happens when the floor mat they've been stepping on for 3 decades finally decides to stand up. Family isn't a license to steal, and as the lights dimmed for the keynote speech, I realized that the only person about to be truly honored tonight was the one they had tried their hardest to keep out of the picture. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom of the North Arlington estate was thick with the cloying scent of white hydrangeas and the metallic sharp tang of $200 bottle Krug champagne as Sloane stood at the mahogany podium, basking in the hollow, unearned applause of 55 guests who represented the peak of Virginia's social hierarchy. She looked every bit the golden child in her $5,000 ivory silk gown, her teeth gleaming under the crystal chandeliers as she prepared to accept an honorary appointment that was nothing more than a fiction bought with my stolen wages and her own sociopathic charm. But as she leaned into the microphone to begin her rehearsed speech about visionary leadership and family values, the massive 85-inch 4K Sony LED screen mounted directly behind her head flickered with a violent burst of static before stabilizing into something far more visceral than her planned leadership excellence slideshow. Instead of filtered photos of her at charity galas, the screen displayed a high-resolution, cold-blooded spreadsheet of 48 months of bank statements, highlighting exactly $500,000 in procurement irregularities and unauthorized wire transfers directly linked to her and Major Sterling's private offshore accounts. The room, which had been buzzing with the polite, performative murmurs of the elite, suddenly plunged into a vacuum of shock as the first line of the audio recording I had captured at 2:14 a.m. began to pulse through the high-fidelity Bose surround sound system, drowning out the expensive, forgettable strains of the string quartet. Sloane's voice, stripped of its public sweetness and replaced by a dry, predatory rasp, filled every corner of the $1.8 million colonial, echoing off the crown molding I had personally paid to have restored just last summer. The guests froze mid-sip as they heard her clearly describe our father as nothing more than a useful signature machine whose only remaining value was the equity in his home, followed by her assessment of me as little more than marrow to be sucked dry until the bone was brittle enough to snap. I stood in the shadows near the catering entrance, my thumb still pressed against the brushed aluminum edge of my tablet, watching the blood drain from her face until she was as pale as the silk draped across her shoulders. The sound of a heavy crystal glass shattering on the dark Brazilian cherry hardwood floor was the only thing louder than the suffocating silence that followed the recording, as my father's hand began to shake so violently that his Macallan 18 spilled across the white linen tablecloth. He looked at the screen, then at his favorite daughter, seeing the forensic auditor's red-inked annotations that detailed the systematic draining of his retirement accounts to fund her $125,000 white Mercedes-AMG G63 and the $9,000 catering bill for this very event. Major Sterling, who had been standing near the bar with the practiced posture of a man who thought he had already won, turned to bolting toward the exit, but the heavy oak doors remained locked. A final logistical detail I had coordinated with the security staff before the first guest had even arrived. I didn't need to say a word because the data I had painstakingly compiled over 5 years of being treated like invisible infrastructure was doing the talking for me, stripping away the aesthetic she had murdered our grandfather's legacy to maintain. The honorary appointment was dead, replaced by the clinical reality of a forensic audit and the looming shadow of a grand jury investigation into the $1.8 million house transfer she had tried to finalize behind my back. As the audio looped one last time, capturing her laughter as she called me a floor mat, I realized that the woman who had spent 30 years trying to ruin my face in every family photo was finally the only one in the room that no one wanted to look at. Family isn't about the name on the trust or the prestige of the uniform. It is the integrity of the ground you stand on, and as the lights in the ballroom flickered under the weight of the truth, I watched the floor finally open up beneath the only person who truly deserved to fall. The electronic feedback from the microphone died into a vacuum of absolute, suffocating silence as I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains, the sharp lines of my charcoal gray Garrison bespoke suit cutting through the golden haze of the chandeliers like a forensic blade. I walked toward the stage with a measured rhythmic stride, the sound of my $700 Italian leather soles on the polished Brazilian cherry hardwood echoing like a countdown that had finally reached zero. I looked directly at Sloane, whose features were transitioning from a carefully curated porcelain mask to the gray, crumbling texture of wet ash as the data on the 85-inch screen behind her continued to scroll through the $500,000 in procurement irregularities she had orchestrated with Major Sterling. I've registered a variant of my signature with the Federal Clearinghouse for years as a standard security protocol for my defense contracts, I said, my voice projected through the high-fidelity Bose surround system with a clinical, terrifying calm that made several guests physically recoil. The power of attorney document you coerced me into signing during that staged family dinner yesterday at the Capitol Grill wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a digital tripwire that triggered a high-priority honeypot alert at the Treasury Department the exact microsecond you attempted to have it notarized by your contact in Georgetown. The room seemed to tilt as two military police officers, who had been stationed in the marble lobby since 8:15 p.m. under the authority of a federal subpoena I had coordinated, stepped through the heavy oak doors with a precision that silenced even the murmurs of the catering staff. Major Sterling attempted to adjust his dress blues, a pathetic reflex of a man who had forgotten that a uniform is a symbol of honor and not a cloak for grand larceny, before he was gripped by the elbows and escorted out into the humid Virginia night. My father's face was a map of sudden, devastating realization, his eyes darting from the screen to me as he finally understood that the utility daughter he had relegated to the back of the room was the only reason the $1.8 million roof over his head hadn't been seized by creditors 6 months ago. He looked at the wine stains spreading across the white linen tablecloth, a vivid Rorschach test of his own failures, while my mother clutched her imitation sapphire pendant as if it could somehow protect her from the sudden evaporation of her social standing. Sloane tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but there were no words left in her vocabulary to explain the $125,000 Mercedes G63, or the systematic draining of our father's remaining 401k to fund her aesthetic delusions. I stood at the edge of the stage, looking at the family that had treated me like a floor mat for 31 years, and felt a profound, icy clarity that no amount of their manufactured warmth could ever replicate. I had spent half a decade acting as the invisible safety net, the logistics coordinator for their vanity, and the silent financier of their lies, but as the MP's footsteps faded into the distance, I realized that the ceiling I had been holding up was finally free to collapse. They had mistaken my silence for compliance and my administrative skills for a lack of ambition, never imagining that the person who manages the movement of millions in military hardware would also know exactly how to dismantle a house of cards from the inside out. Family isn't a biological mandate to endure abuse. It is a reciprocal agreement of respect and protection, and since they had chosen to treat me as marrow to be sucked dry, I was simply returning the favor by leaving them with the empty, hollow bones of their own reputations. As I turned to leave the ballroom, the string quartet sat frozen with their bows suspended in mid-air, a perfect metaphor for a life of performative grace that had finally, irrevocably run out of music. The aftermath of that night at the officers' club was less like a social fallout and more like a high-velocity surgical debridement, stripping away the infected layers of the Miller legacy until there was nothing left but the raw, cold bone of reality. Major Sterling didn't even make it to the end of the week before the formal charges were brought against him, and he is currently facing an aggressive court-martial for the $500,000 in procurement fraud and the systematic manipulation of military logistics for private gain. Sloane's downfall was slightly more cinematic, occurring exactly 48 hours after her honorary appointment party, when the Arlington County Police arrived at the North Arlington estate with a warrant for forgery and grand larceny. I watched from the window of my modest apartment as the 2025 polar white Mercedes-AMG G63, a vehicle that represented the absolute peak of her vanity and the depth of her theft, was hoisted onto a flatbed tow truck to be repossessed as part of the first wave of legal fees and restitution payments. The $1.8 million colonial home, the stage upon which they had performed their high society lies for decades, didn't last much longer as the $14,200 property tax lien and the $5,800 monthly mortgage payments I had been silently covering became an insurmountable wall of debt the moment my wire transfers ceased. Without my invisible logistics help to stall the creditors and manage the $1,100 utility cycles, my father's shell company Miller Strategic Consulting collapsed within 21 days, revealing a hollow core of bad crypto trades and unpaid office leases in Rosslyn. They were forced to watch as the mahogany furniture and the empty display case that once held my grandfather's 1954 Breitling were liquidated at auction to satisfy a fraction of the $620,000 I had documented in the forensic audit. My parents and Sloane eventually moved into a cramped, 700-square-foot basement apartment in a fading section of Falls Church, a space where the air smells of damp concrete and the rent is a staggering $2,150 a month, a sum they can barely scrape together now that their credit scores have cratered below 540. I sat in my office at the defense firm, looking at the final reconciliation report on my dual-monitor setup, realizing that the utility daughter they had tried to erase was the only thing that had kept them from the cold pavement for the last 5 years. I spent my weekend moving the last of my belongings into a new townhouse in Alexandria, a place bought entirely with my own transparent, hard-earned salary, and the silence there is the most expensive thing I own. There were no more $1,200 boutique charges hitting my phone, no more 2 a.m. calls about emergency car repairs for a Mercedes they couldn't afford, and no more absorbing the blame for a lifestyle I never asked to join. My mother still sends the occasional text from a burner phone, weeping about the lack of central air conditioning and the indignity of living near a bus stop, but I simply archive the messages and return to my spreadsheets. Family is often described as a safety net, but in my experience, a net can just as easily become a web if you aren't careful about who is doing the weaving. I chose to stop being the silk that held their predatory world together, and in doing so I finally learned that the most important logistic to manage isn't a shipment of hardware or a bank transfer. It is the distance you put between yourself and the people who only love you for what they can take. The Miller name no longer carries weight in the halls of the officers' club, and as I watched the sunset over the Potomac, I realized that for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't an administrator for someone else's life. I was finally the sole proprietor of my own. My grandfather's ceremonial brass compass might be gone, sold for a down payment on a repossessed car, but I no longer need it to find my way, because the path forward is finally clear of the wreckage they left behind. The air in my new home office in Old Town Alexandria smelled of fresh white oak floorboards and the faint, expensive scent of Le Labo Santal 26, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, mold-heavy atmosphere of the basement apartment where my parents and Sloane were currently unraveling. I stood before a custom-built walnut display case that cost exactly $4,800, my hands gloved in white cotton as I carefully arranged my grandfather's original medals, including his silver star and the bronze eagle, which I had secretly tracked down and bought back from a high-end pawn shop in Arlington for a staggering $18,500. Placing the tarnished 1942 ceremonial brass compass back on its velvet perch felt like restoring the very soul of the Miller legacy. A legacy that Sloan had tried to liquidate for the down payment on a white Mercedes-AMG G63 that had already been hauled away by a repossession team in the middle of a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The weight of the metals in my hand was a physical reminder that honor cannot be inherited or stolen. It must be earned through the kind of grueling, silent work that my family had spent 31 years pretending I wasn't doing. As I adjusted the recessed LED lighting to hit the silver star at a perfect 45-degree angle, my phone buzzed on the desk with a notification that made my jaw tighten with a familiar, weary reflex. It was a 1,200-word email from my mother, sent from a burner account because I had blocked every other point of contact, titled Family Loyalty and Our Shared Future in a font size that screamed of desperation and unearned entitlement. The message was a rambling, narcissistic manifesto begging for a loan of $15,000 to cover their moving transition and Sloan's escalating legal fees, filled with manipulative references to my childhood and the supposed sacrifices they had made to raise a daughter as practical as me. They spoke of blood being thicker than water and the sanctity of the family unit, completely ignoring the fact that they had stood by and sipped Chardonnay while Sloan called me a floor mat and planned to dump our father into a state-subsidized assisted living facility once they had drained the equity from the $1.8 million North Arlington Colonial. I sat down in my $2,400 Herman Miller Aeron chair, the mechanical precision of the seat reflecting the cold, calculated clarity of my new life, and looked at the wall of text that attempted to guilt-trip me into becoming their invisible infrastructure once again. I didn't feel anger or the old, sharp sting of rejection. I simply felt the clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a necrotic limb that could no longer be saved. My parents were still living in a 700-square-foot basement where the rent was $2,150 a month, a sum they could no longer afford because I had stopped the $5,800 monthly mortgage bridge payments that had kept their delusions of grandeur afloat for 5 years. I didn't draft a long-winded rebuttal or attempt to explain the $620,000 I had already bled out for them. Instead, I typed one single devastatingly simple sentence. I am currently busy with high-level defense operations. Please direct all further inquiries to my legal representative at Sterling & Associates. Hitting send felt like the final click of a deadbolt, a total and permanent foreclosure on the Miller family's access to my life, my labor, and my bank account. I realized in that moment that I am no longer the fine print hidden at the bottom of their social contracts, the quiet girl who manages the logistics of their vanity while they take all the credit in the photos. I am the entire contract, the architect of my own fortune, and the sole guardian of the only history in this family worth saving. Family isn't a biological mandate to endure a lifetime of theft and emotional erosion. It is a bond built on the integrity of the ground you stand on together. As I closed the manila folder containing the forensic audit that had dismantled Sloan's life, I looked at the compass on my desk and knew exactly where I was going, leaving them behind to navigate the wreckage of a world they thought I was too plain to own. I sat on the private balcony of my new Alexandria townhouse, the wrought iron railing cold against my palms as I swirled a heavy crystal tumbler of 18-year-old the Macallan Sherry Oak, watching the sun dip below the Potomac River in a spectacular smear of bruised purple and burnt orange. For the first time in an entire decade, the heavy weight of my secondary encrypted satellite handset remained silent on the teak side table, and my primary iPhone didn't vibrate with a single frantic notification or a guilt-tripping text message from the basement apartment in Falls Church. There were no more panicked 2 a.m. demands for a financial bridge to cover a luxury car payment, no more manipulative reminders from my mother to not make things awkward at the next stage charity gala, and no more cold dismissals from a father who only saw me as a walking ledger for his failed crypto trades. The silence surrounding me wasn't lonely or hollow. It was profoundly, exquisitely expensive, a hard-won peace that felt more substantial than any of the high society lies I had spent my youth maintaining for people who viewed me as nothing more than an invisible safety net. I looked at the condensation trailing down the side of my glass and realized with a clinical, surgical clarity that I had spent exactly $620,000 over 5 years trying to buy the affection of people who were fundamentally incapable of offering it to anyone but themselves. I had bled my savings dry to cover $5,800 monthly mortgage payments on a house that eventually sold for $1.8 million to satisfy creditors I was no longer willing to stall, and in return I was treated like a floor mat that was ruining the aesthetic of their curated family portraits. In contrast, the $15,000 I had invested in a comprehensive forensic audit and the $3,500 I spent on high-level legal representation had provided a return on investment that was immeasurable, effectively buying my life back from the wreckage of the Miller legacy. My grandfather's original silver star and his 1942 ceremonial brass compass were now safely secured in my home office, recovered from the pawn shop where Sloan had discarded them, serving as the only true north I would ever need again. The evening air carried the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint, salty tang of the river, a sensory profile that held none of the suffocating tension that used to define every interaction within the North Arlington estate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch, the liquid warm and smoky against my throat, and felt the final threads of obligation dissolve into the twilight as I looked at the distant lights of the city. My parents were likely sitting in their 700-square-foot basement right now, staring at a $2,150 rent invoice they couldn't pay, while Sloan faced the grim reality of a grand larceny charge and the loss of her $125,000 white Mercedes-AMG G63. They had spent 30 years trying to convince me that I was the secondary character in their story, the administrative help who existed only to absorb their blame and subsidize their vanity. But as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, I knew the truth. Family isn't a blood-bound contract to endure systematic erosion. It is the integrity of the people who stand beside you when the lights go out. And since I was the only one who ever held the flashlight, I was perfectly comfortable finally turning it toward my own path. I set my glass down with a firm, decisive click on the table, leaned back into the plush outdoor cushions, and let the expensive silence of my freedom wash over me like a benediction. My family spent 3 decades convinced they could simply edit me out of the frame like a stray shadow in a high-fashion editorial, but they made the fatal mistake of forgetting that I was the one who actually owned the camera, the lighting, and the very ground they stood on. Now, as the morning sun bleeds over the Potomac, the reality of their situation is as cold and unforgiving as the steel of the handcuffs that snapped around my sister's wrists. Sloan is currently looking at 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for a sophisticated cocktail of forgery, grand larceny, and procurement fraud, while my parents are finally learning the true devastating cost of a life built on nothing but aesthetic and stolen labor. They are currently sequestered in that 700-square-foot basement in Falls Church, a space where the linoleum is peeling and the air is thick with the scent of cheap detergent and the crushing weight of their own insignificance. I sat on my balcony in Alexandria, the silence of my $1.2 million townhouse serving as the only soundtrack I needed, and watched as a 2024 midnight black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, the kind of vehicle my father used to think he deserved, pulled away from the curb across the street. I realized then that I had spent $620,000 trying to purchase the affection of people who viewed me as a disposable resource, a practical convenience that kept the lights on and the creditors at bay while they chased the ghost of their former status. The $1.8 million North Arlington Colonial is gone, sold to a developer who will likely gut the mahogany study where my grandfather's legacy was once kept, and the $125,000 polar white Mercedes-AMG G63 that Sloan treated like a throne has been liquidated to pay the first installment of the $500,000 restitution she owes to the federal government. They sent me a final 1,200-word email from a shared library computer, a desperate, rambling plea for family loyalty that I deleted after reading only the first 3 sentences. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their hollow promises of reform because I am no longer the fine print at the bottom of their lives. I am the entire contract, and the terms of our engagement have been permanently terminated. I spent $15,000 on a forensic audit that acted as a tactical strike against their house of cards, and the return on that investment has been the reclamation of my own soul. As I looked at my grandfather's 1942 ceremonial brass compass sitting on my desk, its needle steady and true, I understood that I was never the plain daughter or the invisible help. I was the architect who allowed them to live in a mansion of my making until they decided to set fire to the curtains. The silence wasn't lonely, it was expensive and hard-won, a luxury more profound than any bottle of Krug champagne or designer dress Sloan ever charged to my account. Family isn't a biological mandate to endure systematic erosion, and it isn't the name on a trust or the prestige of a uniform. Family is the integrity of the people who stand beside you when the world turns cold, and as I watched the last of the morning mist lift off the river, I realized that I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, on ground that I owned outright, with a horizon that was finally clear of their wreckage. They wanted me to be a ghost, so I became one. the kind that took everything when I left and left them with nothing but the echo of a door closing for the very last time.